Okay. A very warm welcome to our Discourse and Sustainability webinar. I'm Michael Kranert. I'm co-chairing this with Michael Forelli from Hull. We are running sort of this series on the DiscourseNet platform. DiscourseNet is the International Organization of Discourse Studies, so feel free to have a look at the website and also sign up for our group, and even better, become a member of DiscourseNet, which will support their activities. I'll put that in the chat. We are going to record this session, only the talk itself, and when we end the talk, before we do the discussion, we will stop the recording. But if you don't want to be sort of in this room while it's recorded, then you would have to leave, but we will not record you discussing this. But you can catch up with the talk then on YouTube, and you can catch up with the last two talks by Ben Clark and Jonathan Joseph as well. And I will now hand over to Michael to introduce our speaker today.
Yeah, hello everyone. We're delighted to have Kelsey Campbell from Ulster University to speak in the seminar today. It's a Kelsey's PhD is on a slightly different topic, so this is a kind of a sideline, a very interesting and worthwhile sideline for her. This paper is one that has also been given previously at the European Consortium for Political Research, which was held in Prague last year, and it won the prize for best paper in the theoretical perspectives in policy analysis study group. So it's one that I'm really looking forward to seeing. I unfortunately missed that previous one due to COVID, but so I get a chance to see it now. So Kelsey, I don't know, we've got half an hour or so to talk, and then we've got questions and comments after that. So, but not too strict. So, Kelsey, please go ahead. Hi.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much. So first off, I want to thank Michael and Michal for inviting me to present and for organizing this brilliant seminar series. I've really enjoyed all of the other seminars in the series, so I'm really pleased to be a part of it here today. So my title for today is Neoliberalism in the Glasgow Climate Pact, Interdiscursivity and Faux-Sustainability at COP26. Personally, my background is in critical discourse analysis, so that's the perspective I'll be using to approach the discussion today. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the ways in which neoliberal discourses of economic growth permeated and undermined the so-called discourses of sustainability present at COP26 in Glasgow. I realize that we're already a few COPs past the Glasgow one, but I'd highly recommend checking out Michael and Tom's podcast series, which talks a lot more about the COPs than I'll be able to do here. So most of you are likely already familiar with the context of the COPs, but I'll try to provide just a bit of background on COP26 to set the scene before I talk more about its individual components. Slides here. Right, so what was COP26? The Conference of the Parties, abbreviated as COP or COP, is an annual United Nations climate change conference that's hosted by a different UN country each year. In 2021, COP26 was held in Glasgow, Scotland, with the UK acting as host. The main purpose of the COPs officially is to bring together all members of the UN to discuss and plan global action to counteract global warming. Most years, the conference comes and goes without too much fanfare or public attention, but some previous notable COPs that most people have probably heard of resulted in the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 and the Paris Agreement in 2015. COP26 was also intended to be one of these notable COPs, resulting in the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was heralded as the most significant international agreement on the topic of climate change since the Paris Agreement. So among COP26 official stated purposes were to deliver on the terms of the Paris Agreement, namely the pledge to keep overall global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius in this century, and to get individual countries to adopt new policies that would effectively achieve that goal. That's because despite the 1.5 degree pledge, the policies that were agreed in Paris would result in approximately 3 degrees of warming. This primary goal can be seen over and over in the organizers' framing of the conference and its promotional materials, with phrases like, quote, COP26 is our best last chance to get runaway climate change under control, quote, we need to finalize the Paris rulebook, and the repeated tagline, keeping 1.5 alive. So it's worth noting at this point, before we go any further, that global surface air temperatures have actually exceeded 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels every month since July of last year. This doesn't actually mean reaching 1.5, as the numbers that are usually referenced refer to 30-year averages. And by that metric, we're currently at 1.27 degrees, but I still think it's important context. So the UK also put forward 4 official goals for COP26, which guided pretty much all of the materials they produced before, during, and after the conference. These were mitigation, or keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, adaptation, or loss and damage, which I'll come back to later, finance, a rather amorphous category, which acted as both a noun and a verb interchangeably, and was often found in the conference materials with the collocation mobilize finance, and collaboration, i.e. bringing together various stakeholders who are specifically named as governments, businesses, and civil society. So as you can see here in the screenshot from the COP26 website following the conference, the UK presidency obviously felt like they did a good job of meeting these goals. All of the post-conference materials strongly emphasize these points, which were nonetheless preordained outcomes. That is, following the official materials and changes to the website before, during, and after the conference shows that these 4 topics, framed as goals beforehand, seamlessly morphed into accomplishments afterwards, with very little additional details to explain how it was that the organizers could have predicted the outcomes so perfectly. So putting the many aspects of the climate crisis somewhat to the side for now, my purpose with this presentation is to demonstrate how the discourse of mandatory growth ideology is embedded within the discourse of COP26 to such an extent as to nullify the stated goals of the conference itself, as well as its primary outcomes, including the Glasgow Climate Pact. So, what is mandatory growth ideology? This will be a very oversimplified explanation, as I'm a discourse analyst, not an economist, but hopefully it'll be sufficient for our purposes here today. Very simply, mandatory growth ideology revolves around the idea that the economy, however defined, must by absolute necessity constantly grow. And not only must it grow, but generally speaking, it must grow by a larger percentage each year. This viewpoint has become a quasi-truth in Western culture and society, though it has come to permeate virtually every corner of the globe. It's also often taken as a fundamental baseline assumption in many undergraduate economics courses. What people and politicians usually mean by the growth of the economy in practical terms are things like, for example, GDP continuing to increase, employment percentages for the population to increase or remain high, the profits of companies to increase exponentially year on year, and steady inflation in the form of an increase in the price of goods and services, and hopefully correspondingly, the uplift of wages. Though I think we can all see very clearly, especially over the last few years, these two things don't always go hand in hand. In short, the ever-increasing growth of the economy, an amorphous entity most typically represented by corporate profits and budget surpluses, is often seen as a necessary precondition of life in the world as we know it. Occasionally, an increase in the so-called standard of living of individuals is also cited as an outcome of economic growth, but this is usually only represented as a secondary or axillary consequence of a healthy economy. So what's more, the hegemony of neoliberal capitalism, not only in the West, but around the world, means that it's become difficult for most people to even recognize mandatory growth as an ideology rather than a universal truth. In other words, mandatory growth ideology has developed significant symbolic and social power in almost all mainstream discursive spaces that has become its own regime of truth, The power of this ideology has become so great that even those who purport to be left of center politically are either forced to accept it to maintain mainstream relevance, or in some cases seem to genuinely buy into it themselves. We see this even in the highly lauded UN Sustainable Development Goals. The very premise of many of them rests on an acceptance of mandatory growth ideology. The SDGs currently are considered the global gold standard for equity, human rights, and environmental action, and as products of the UN are obviously closely related to the paradigm of the COPs. Of course, as the so-called gold standard for future planning and social initiatives, the Sustainable Development Goals have received considerable attention from many organizations and institutions, including universities. They are routinely prioritized in funding and hiring schemes in UK and Irish universities, and job candidates are sometimes asked to evaluate their own research against them. The screenshot you see here is actually from my own university profile after the support team painstakingly went through every individual's research outputs, even PhD researchers like myself, and unilaterally assigned them a personalized SDG profile. And this is just an anecdotal example, but it points to how dominant the UN discourses on sustainability have become in the global sphere. So naturally, we have to ask, what does this mean for mandatory growth ideology to be embedded in these discourses of sustainability? So in short, nothing good. Basically, we need to problematize the idea that capitalism can actually be sustainable in any form. It's been proven that CO2 emissions correlate with GDP per capita, with richer countries producing more emissions, and this isn't even really controversial. We also have significant evidence that economic growth by any measure is not compatible with what climate scientists know needs to be done to make substantial progress toward a habitable planet. Unfortunately, conversations about alternatives to mandatory growth ideology, like A growth and D growth, primarily take place in academic or niche contexts, while mainstream discourses of sustainability almost universally presuppose adherence to mandatory growth ideology. In general, in the mainstream context, conversations about economic issues heavily focus on words like jobs, wages, and livelihoods, which are all current neoliberal euphemisms for the capitalist concept of money. However, they also dismiss or ignore the fact that these concepts themselves are ideological assumptions linked to capitalism as a hegemonic regime of truth. From an anti-capitalist or degrowth perspective, there is no reason why we have to tie a person's literal ability to live to their economic productivity. This association is not just metaphorical, it's literal. We can see both in the semantic relationship embedded in the word livelihood, which I'll come back to. It's simply taken for granted that such an arrangement is natural and or that society must continue in this way because it's either too impractical or too dangerous to change it. But a growing body of interdisciplinary degrowth scholarship is seeking to change that. So that's the general framework that I'm using to approach the research. Methodologically, I practice a type of critical discourse analysis that aligns quite closely with the values and motivations of critical policy discourse analysis, or CPDA, as outlined in the 2019 book co-edited by one of our hosts for this seminar. So in the introduction, the editors describe CPDA as, quote, an analytical framework capable of capturing and conceptualizing in relation to their socially structuring potential the fine details of text, which are often overlooked in policy analysis, but which have effects on how policy is understood, developed, and implemented. Specifically, I welcome CDPA's focus on micro-level analysis as a way to, quote, enrich the analysis of policy discourse. So there are many ways of doing CDA, each with its own special focus. I'm currently developing a streamlined procedure for CDA that I call Identify, Isolate, Contextualize, which you can see in graphical form here. Put simply, it's a practical procedural method for doing CDA that takes into account the recursivity inherent in the multiple layers of linguistic and contextual information under analysis. I also take inspiration from the field of ecolinguistics, which has sometimes aligned itself quite closely with CDA and focuses on identifying and analyzing the narrative framing of environmental discourses. As Aaron Stibbe describes it, quote, ecolinguistics consists of questioning the stories that underpin our current unsustainable civilization, exposing those stories that are clearly not working and that are leading to ecological disruption and social injustice, and finding new stories that work better in the conditions of the world that we face. So in my view, ecolinguistics and critical policy discourse analysis are compatible frameworks because the underlying values and foundational assumptions that they share, as well as the overlapping conceptual toolbox from which they draw various analytical tools. For example, they both facilitate and necessitate the examination of discourses with an over-political stance taken by the researcher. So for this research, I'm conceptualizing COP26 as a discursive space that encompasses both tangible and intangible texts. By viewing the conference as a holistic space, we can consider not only the content of the discussions, speeches, and other texts, but also the equally important aspects of conference organization and planning. With highly publicized yet exclusive events like the COPs, these elements become even more important. So as it's a largely private event, this starts with who's invited and just as significantly, who isn't. Attendees at COP26 were disproportionately from privileged backgrounds, including celebrities and other famous people. Some estimates show that anywhere between 60 and 120 private jets flew in for the conference, including Boris Johnson's highly publicized flights between London and Glasgow. We know that commercial air travel is one of the most destructive things for the climate, and private jets obviously take this a step further. In terms of physical space, there were two parts to COP26. The private invite-only space where the actual decisions were made, dubbed the Blue Zone, which you can see here on the map, and the public exhibition space in the Glasgow Science Centre, dubbed the Green Zone. Access to the Blue Zone was strictly controlled by the UN and was primarily for government dignitaries, VIPs, and UN-approved observers. This is where the actual closed-door negotiations took place that led to the Glasgow Climate Pact. In terms of physical area, the Green Zone made up only a fraction of the total space devoted to COP26 in Glasgow, which could be seen maybe as a convenient coincidence, if not explicit evidence of the lack of symbolic space given to the public in elite climate discourses. The contradictions represented by the lack of democracy and the climate hypocrisy of various high-profile attendees of the conference can also be seen in many instances of greenwashing present in the discursive space. One of the most amusing examples of greenwashing that made the rounds on social media at the time was the menu from the conference, which, despite extensive bragging about how sustainable the offerings were, was revealed to be woefully inadequate. Only 40% of the menu was plant-based, despite the fact that animal-based food products are major contributors to current greenhouse gas emissions. However, this fact has been heavily lobbied against by corporate interests in many Western countries. Additionally, the menus featured these little icons that were meant to show the carbon footprint of each item, with the intention that individual attendees could so-called vote with their wallets, as they say, should they wish to limit their own emissions. So a bit of classic microeconomic capitalism. Of course, as we've seen with certain other current ubiquitous global crises, solutions are not born of an insistence on personal or individual responsibility, but on structural choices. Corporate sponsorship was and continues to be, via the archived COP26 website, a significant and visible presence at the conference. At one time, the list of these 11 corporate sponsors took up a disproportionate amount of space at the bottom of almost every page on the website. Physically speaking, they also took up the most space at the conference venue itself, and were allowed to construct massive installations of what essentially amounts to corporate advertising in both the Green Zone and the Blue Zone, as well as outdoor space around the venue in Glasgow. So, speaking of the Green Zone was where all of the UK-approved organizations who were allowed to come to COP26 could set up stalls, and members of the public could book limited numbers of tickets to attend certain events, like film screenings, poetry readings, and talks by activists. Tickets were very limited and went quickly, leading to some pushback about inclusivity. With a few days left until the end of the conference, the organizers finally started allowing members of the public in Glasgow to walk around the green zone and view the stalls without a ticket. Over 100 organizations were allowed to have stalls in the green zone, but many of those were part of the revolving exhibits, which were only featured for one day each. The permanent exhibitors included all 11 of the official corporate sponsors, plus dozens more for-profit corporations. These included, for example, car manufacturers like Ford and Rolls-Royce, a sports car racing company, a speedboat company, a self-described high-risk investment company, and various rebranded pet projects and advertising campaigns from the 11 main sponsors dressed up to look like independent ventures. So this is what passed as the people's space of the conference, the only part of COP26 that was partially accessible to the public. Widespread corporate advertising aside, there were also countless economic adjacent accessibility issues caused by, not least, the ongoing COVID pandemic, a lack of childcare facilities, travel expenses and visa requirements for the UK, disability access problems at the venue, and an overall lack of representation of Indigenous and youth populations. So in the COP26 outcomes, as put out as part of the Climate Pact, we can also find dominance of neoliberal discourses in the texts produced by the conference. So these images show the overview of the major positive outcomes of COP26 as published by the UK organizers. You can see that they're divided into 4 columns corresponding with the 4 rhetorically constructed goals that I mentioned earlier. I won't take time to go through all of these with you, but I just wanted to show you that I went through and I coded each of them on the basis of whether or not they relied either in whole or in part on neoliberal capitalism and mandatory growth ideology. So I've circled the ones that fulfill that criteria. There's only a few exceptions there on the second page. So I've also looked at the most prominent public speeches from the conference. And though I don't have the time to go through all of the results here, I wanted to highlight some of the language most relevant to the economic aspect. So as Prime Minister and thus host of the conference, Boris Johnson gave the welcoming speech in which he strongly and repeatedly emphasized the need for a, quote, green industrial revolution. First off, climate scientists have been telling us that it's the original industrial revolution that has galvanized the current climate crisis more than anything else. So this is perhaps ironic at best. However, Boris does seem to acknowledge this when he mentions that the first steam engine was built in Glasgow and goes on to say, quote, "Yes, my friends, we have brought you to the very place where the doomsday device began to tick." Notice in this excerpt how he also positions himself as a member of the in-group with the first person, quote, "we in the developed world," which is constructed in direct opposition to the somewhat condescending everybody else, who apparently we in the developed world have a special responsibility to help. As an aside, you could replace the word responsibility with the close synonym, perhaps burden, and see how that sounds for yourself. He continues in this way, being very careful not to emphasize that the in-group that he's constructed, we in the developed world, are not part of the group that need to make progress. Instead, the developed world, led by the UK, is represented as being beyond the need for the primary business of COP26, thanks entirely to capitalism, or in other words, the all-important private sector. Here, we see Boris appeal to the multilateral development banks to take action, quote, "so that the private sector can come in just the same way that it was the private sector that enabled the UK to end our dependence on coal." From a CDA perspective, the private sector is thus constructed as the mythopoetic hero figure, guiding the enlightened UK to sustainability and prosperity, while the developed world must embrace the responsibility to help, quote, "our friends in the South." In Prince, now King, Charles's opening speech on behalf of the monarchy as the head of state, we see essentially the same narrative going on. Indeed, he mentions very early on that the solution to the climate crisis is to simply, quote, put a value on carbon, which would in turn apparently push down the market price of carbon capture technologies. So here we have the King of England lamenting that other countries simply can't afford these planet-saving technologies, either due to some mysterious stroke of bad luck, or worse, due to their own financial mismanagement, as you see in the mention of debt here. This assertion is followed by a war metaphor in which the private sector, rather than being the source of unaffordable prices, is in fact the only way to bring prices down. Many environmental activists and other people who paid close attention to COP26 contrasted these speeches with that of David Attenborough, the third high-profile speaker at the conference, who carried the official title of the People's Advocate. Now, a couple things. First, it says something about the tone of the conference and the leadership involved that the three most high-profile speeches came from three very wealthy, white, British men of a certain age. Second, I'd like to consider the title of the People's Advocate itself. I think it's fair to say that David Attenborough is certainly not representative of the average person. Also, we could ask what people this title is referring to. Is it the British people? Is it the lay people attending the conference in the green zone, but not the blue? Is it everyone in the world? It's pretty vague. From a discourse point of view, it's significant that such a position was created and named in the first place. In other words, its mere existence calls into question why we need a people's advocate in the first place. The implication being that the rest of the conference, its leadership, speeches, etc., are not in the people's interests. In short, it's somewhat ironic that the position that one could assume was meant to provide a more representative feel to the conference actually ends up calling attention to how undemocratic it actually is. David Attenborough's speech was admittedly less overtly celebratory of neoliberal capitalism than the other two. However, significantly, he still calls for a, quote, new industrial revolution, just like Boris Johnson, and positions carbon capture technology as the most important or perhaps only solution to the crisis. In general, his speech was more aspirational and pathos-oriented than logos-oriented, but individual words here and there still hint at an underlying ideology that does little to disrupt the status quo. For example, affordable clean energy. This presupposes that clean energy can't be made available without taking into account a market-based price, and is something that, nevertheless, is something that individual members of the public should still be responsible for paying for. Interestingly, he subtly subverts the emphasis Boris and Charles put on developed countries by saying that no nation has completed its development because no nation is yet sustainable. While this is certainly in direct contradiction to Boris's claim that countries like the UK have nothing left to do with regards to climate adaptation, it is nevertheless a long way from refuting the hegemony of capitalism and mandatory growth ideology. I'd argue that it would be very difficult to do that while still relying on the same terminology and underlying framework as most overtly neoliberal actors that we saw on the last slide. So in other conference texts, including the final Glasgow Climate Pact, the phrase just transition crops up again and again, typically when topics of equality and fairness come up. However, the term itself explicitly refers to equal access to the spoils of economic growth, as you can see in this definition, as if enabling women, indigenous communities, and people from low-income parts of the world to access their fair share of the profit pie is seemingly the best we can hope for. It doesn't usually, for example, imply any kind of subversion of the capitalist status quo, including the need for individuals to rely on their livelihoods to simply survive, or for communities to be subject to the whims of a labor-based market economy. According to this definition, a just transition is akin to putting nominal regulations on the free market to supposedly make it fairer, but it does not ultimately question the validity of the economic system itself. So these screenshots will give you just some examples of just a few of the many times the phrase shows up in official COP26 texts. So the main tool for mitigating climate change, according to the Glasgow Climate Pact and other celebrated UN publications like the IPCC report, is the idea of carbon markets. Carbon markets are, as the name implies, a way of buying and selling carbon credits, which are essentially a license to emit. The idea is that if individual groups, like countries or corporations, are given a set expenditure of allowable greenhouse gas emissions, but some groups find they aren't using their entire allowance while others are exceeding theirs, the group with extra can sell their surplus carbon credits to the group in need. This basic system has been known by many other names for decades now, including terms like cap and trade, carbon fees and dividends, and carbon tax. Though the specifics are heavily debated and new buzzwords seem to crop up every couple of years, they're all essentially based on the idea that you can free market your way to reduced emissions. That is, that countries or corporations will have an incentive to burn fewer fossil fuels because they'll be able to make money off of it, just as it would cost them more if they needed to buy extra allowances. One of the four main goals and outcomes, as already stated, asserted by the COP26 organizers, fell under the heading of loss and damage, though it often appears under the alternate title adaptation. While the official documents don't seem too keen on elaborating on exactly what is meant by the term adaptation, there are countless references to the need to increase something called adaptation finance. In fact, all Climate Pact outcomes relating to this category appear to be vaguely financial in nature, with occasional token reference to planned financial assistance for Indigenous peoples. Although website navigation and list headlines seem to favor the use of the term adaptation over loss and damage, likely because space constraints are a factor, it's clear when reading through the Climate Pact that the terms are used interchangeably. However, the connotations of these two terms are clearly different. The term adaptation conjures up images of bold civil engineering projects and successful coastal management, while loss and damage calls up visions of destroyed, flooded homes and cities swallowed up by the sea. And so you have a positive, hopeful message on the one hand, and a much more sort of realistic or pessimistic image on the other. So what then can we make of the references to the funding supposedly earmarked for these purposes? Are we building seawalls and helping people to construct more protective homes? Or are we simply paying people, or maybe even companies, off after their homes have been destroyed and they become displaced? Another quasi-metaphor, or perhaps more accurately, euphemism, that shows up again and again pretty much every time the threat to actual human beings is acknowledged, is that of livelihoods. The phrase protect lives and livelihoods, or something very similar, appears in basically every type of text produced by COP26. The parallelism on display between the terms lives and livelihoods in this phrase seems to equate the importance of people's actual lives with their jobs. So bear in mind that the need to, quote, save jobs or create jobs is a crucial part of mandatory growth ideology and neoliberal discourse. The repetition of this phrase throughout COP26 serves not only to position the importance of lives and jobs as being equal, but along with the term livelihood itself, may even go a step further to create a metonymic relationship between the two, whereby a person's job or livelihood begins to stand in for their actual life. So in this presentation today, I've attempted to show just some examples of how neoliberal capitalism and mandatory growth ideology are normalized and naturalized in the discursive space of COP26. So we've seen this through various keywords and phrases like just transition and lives and livelihoods, but also through various multimodal semiotic markers like branding, physical space, and access rights, along with an overt deference to profit interests through the corporate sponsors. We've also seen high-profile non-corporate actors adopting the language of capitalism and private industry, and of course, a fair bit of classic greenwashing. So if we can take as a given that mandatory growth ideology is fundamentally incompatible with efforts to protect the planet, and that capitalist ideologies and discourses result in objectively worse climate outcomes, the question for us as discourse researchers then becomes, how do we go about changing the discourse of sustainability? And what do we change it to? What role can discourse research play, if any, in bringing about the necessary action on the climate crisis? So I know those are very big questions, but thank you very much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts in the discussion.
Thank you, Kelsey. Fantastic talk. Yeah, loads of claps and everything going up. So I'm just going to stop the recording. So we've recorded your talk, Kelsey, and